Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the gas lights, draw those heavy velvet curtains, and definitely step away from the respectable, fog-laden streets of London's high society. Because, let's be honest, grand palaces and bustling markets, a little too clean. Instead, we're going to unlock the chilling, often tragic, secrets of Victorian London's hidden brothels. The clandestine spaces that pulsed with a very different kind of life, throbbing beneath the city's meticulously polite, prudish veneer. Forget your romanticized notions of fallen women. With hearts of gold, tonight we're digging into the harsh realities, the brutal economics, and the genuinely shocking scale of an industry that absolutely thrived in the shadows. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Imagine Victorian London. Sounds grand, right? A city of stark contrasts and profound contradictions, like a top hat worn with mud-caked boots. On one hand, it was the proud capital of a vast empire, a beacon of industrial progress, scientific advancement, and strict, almost suffocating moral rectitude. The very air seemed thick with the pronouncements of proper behaviour, Christian piety, and the sanctity of the family unit. Women, especially, were held to impossible standards of purity, often referred to as angels in the house, their virtue considered the cornerstone of society. To deviate was to fall, to become an outcast, a stain on the social fabric. One wrong move, and poof, your reputation vanished faster than a street urchin with a dropped pie. But beneath this meticulously polished surface, an entirely different London throbbed with a dark, undeniable energy. A city of desperate poverty, crushing social inequality, and a vast, sprawling, and utterly unapologetic sex industry. This was the era of the veiled city, where the respectable classes pretended not to see what was happening just around the corner, or sometimes even within their own meticulously maintained households. The hypocrisy was truly breathtaking. While public discourse condemned prostitution as the ultimate sin, the demand for it was overwhelming, fueled by a rapidly growing male population. We're talking a massive influx of young, unattached men moving to London for work, far from the watchful eyes of family. Sailors poured into port like thirsty sharks. Soldiers garrisoned in the city, restless and, well, human. And a burgeoning class of middle and upper-class men, confined by their own strict moral codes and often marrying late, sought release in the delightful anonymity of the city's vice districts. And the law? While ostensibly against disorderly houses, it was inconsistently enforced, often turning a blind eye or, worse, becoming another tool for exploitation. Because nothing says justice like a constable looking the other way for a few shillings. The sheer scale of prostitution in Victorian London is genuinely shocking. Contemporary estimates, though likely inflated by good old moral panic, suggest that at its peak, there could have been anywhere from 50,000 to 80,000 unfortunates working the streets and brothels of the capital. Even if the true number was closer to 10,000 or 20,000, it still represented a significant portion of the female population, creating a pervasive presence that was simultaneously shunned and utterly integral to the city's underbelly. This wasn't a fringe activity, it was a vast, complex, and deeply embedded ecosystem of vice, ranging from the most opulent, high-class board and lodging houses to the grimmest, most dangerous peniatric dens in the rookeries. Think of it as a dark, unlisted branch of the London Stock Exchange, but instead of shares, they were trading desperation. But why such an explosion of vice? The roots were deeply socio-economic. Victorian London was a city of unprecedented population growth, fueled by the Industrial Revolution. People poured in from the countryside, seeking work, but often found only crushing poverty, overcrowded slums, and a brutal job market. For young, uneducated women, often orphaned, abandoned, or simply unable to survive on the abysmal wages offered for domestic service, factory work, or needlework, which could barely buy a crust of bread, let alone pay rent, prostitution became a desperate, often last resort, means of survival. It offered, for a fleeting moment, the promise of a meal, a roof over one's head, or even a few shillings, often more than an honest day's labour could provide. The choice, for many, was not between virtue and sin, but between prostitution and starvation, or the workhouse, which many considered a fate worse than death. And let me tell you, that's a choice nobody should ever have to make. The geography of vice was as varied as the classes it served. Brothels were not always hidden away in obscure, forgotten alleys. While notorious areas like Whitechapel, Covent Garden, and the infamous Holy Land, St Giles, teemed with vice, houses of ill repute could be found in almost every corner of London. Discreet establishments catered to gentlemen in Westminster and Mayfair, often indistinguishable from respectable townhouses, their windows discreetly curtained, their doors manned by silent, watchful servants. More brazen fancy houses operated openly in theatreland, attracting men after a night at the opera or a play, like a neon sign for questionable decisions. And in the grimmer, poorer districts, the flash houses, or penny gaffs, offered cheap, dangerous encounters in squalid, overcrowded rooms, often sharing walls with legitimate businesses or family homes, their chilling secrets only barely concealed by the perpetual London fog. The very architecture of Victorian London, with its dense terraces, labyrinthine alleys, and countless multi-tenanted buildings, lent itself perfectly to concealment. A respectable front could easily mask a bustling brothel behind it, with back entrances, hidden staircases, and discreet communication systems, ensuring that the two worlds rarely visibly collided. A gentleman could indulge his desires far from the prying eyes of his neighbours or family, dissolving into the teeming masses before returning to his respectable life, his secret safe within the city's vast, indifferent embrace. Yet, this thriving industry was built on a foundation of profound human misery. The chilling secrets were not just about clandestine locations, they were about the young lives consumed, the brutal exploitation, the pervasive disease, and the utter lack of agency for the women trapped within its cruel machinery. The polite society that demanded moral purity simultaneously created the conditions for an explosion of fallen women, then profited from their despair. And in these hidden brothels, away from the gaslight glare of public scrutiny, the true cost of Victorian hypocrisy was paid, in shattered lives and broken spirits, a stark contrast to the empire's glittering facade. All right, we've established the paradoxical landscape of Victorian London, a city both outwardly pious and inwardly riddled with vice. Now, let's step beyond the general geography of sin and venture, metaphorically speaking, through those discreetly curtained doors and into the hidden spaces themselves, the brothels. These weren't just locations. They were meticulously organised, architecturally adapted, and strictly governed domains, each a gilded cage, designed for specific clientele, operated under the watchful, often ruthless eye of the madam. Understanding the inner workings of these establishments reveals a chilling level of calculated exploitation, masked by varying degrees of superficial luxury. It's like a grand illusion, but with much higher stakes. The architecture of a Victorian brothel was a fascinating study in adaptation and deception. For the high-class establishments, often catering to the wealthy and aristocratic, discretion was paramount. These board and lodging houses, or fancy houses, were frequently indistinguishable from respectable townhouses in areas like Mayfair, St John's Wood, or the environs of Piccadilly. Their exteriors were elegant, their windows draped with heavy velvet or lace to obscure the view within, giving no hint of the illicit activities taking place. Just a regular old townhouse, nothing to see here, move along. Multiple drawing rooms, often richly furnished to give an air of domesticity and comfort, served as reception areas where gentlemen would meet the girls. Private parlours provided more intimate spaces for negotiation, think VIP rooms for illicit deals. Crucially, upper floors were often converted into numerous, small, well-appointed bedrooms, each designed for privacy and to maximise quick turnover. Back entrances and hidden staircases allowed discreet access for clients and suppliers, bypassing the main, more visible entrance. The entire layout was an exercise in controlled secrecy, ensuring that the respectable facade was maintained at all costs. It was the ultimate architectural wink and a nudge. Moving down the social scale, the architecture became less about disguise and more about sheer utility. In areas like Covent Garden or the Strand, closer to theatres and popular gentlemen's clubs, brothels might be more overtly commercial. These could occupy entire buildings, often narrow, multi-storey Georgian or early Victorian houses. The ground floor might be a lavishly decorated public room, often mirrored, with plush seating and a piano, designed to entice. Upstairs, the bedrooms would be simpler but still clean, often wallpapered and furnished with a bed and a wash basin. Here, the emphasis was on volume and accessibility for a broader, middle-class clientele. Think of it as the Walmart of vice, less frills, more traffic. Further down still, in the grimy rookeries of Whitechapel, St Giles, or the East End, the flash houses, penny gaffs or cribs offered prostitution at its most desperate. These were often little more than squalid rooms in overcrowded tenement buildings, perhaps a single room with a bed and a bucket, rented by the hour. An alley entrance, a single flickering gas jet, or a red lantern might be the only indication of their purpose. Here, architecture offered no comfort or disguise, only a bare, utilitarian space for the transaction, reflecting the brutal reality of the women who worked within them. No velvet, just sorrow. The madam was the undisputed ruler of the brothel, her domain absolute. She was typically an older woman, often a former prostitute herself, who had risen through the ranks through shrewd business sense, a ruthless streak, and an intimate understanding of the trade. Her role was multifaceted. She managed the property, negotiated with suppliers for food, drink, laundry, paid off corrupt police, recruited and disciplined the girls, and handled all financial transactions with clients. For the high-class houses, madams were often sophisticated, charming women who could run a household with the finesse of a duchess, ensuring discretion and catering to the whims of powerful men. They maintained strict rules of conduct, dictating everything from the girls' attire and presentation to their behaviour with clients. She was the CEO, head of HR, and chief enforcer, all rolled into one expensive silk dress. The rules of the house varied, but were universally enforced. For the girls, absolute obedience to the madam was paramount. Any transgression, stealing from a client, bringing in outside men, breaking curfew, or even a perceived act of insubordination, could result in brutal punishment, including beatings, being locked in a room, or being thrown out onto the streets penniless, a terrifying prospect in Victorian London. Debts were meticulously recorded, and girls often found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt to the madam for their board and lodging, clothes, and even the initial loan for their recruitment. This debt slavery was a powerful tool of control, making escape incredibly difficult. The financial arrangement was also strictly controlled. Girls in all types of brothels rarely kept all their earnings. A significant portion, often 50% or more, went directly to the madam for rent, expenses, or protection. For the women, this meant an endless grind to earn enough to simply survive, to pay off their perpetual debt, or to purchase small comforts. In the higher class houses, the girls might earn enough for fine clothes, occasional treats, and a semblance of luxury. But even then, much of their earnings were reinvested in maintaining the illusion of wealth that clients desired. In the lower class establishments, earnings barely covered the cost of their next meal. Survival, not savings, was the name of the game. Girls would spend their mornings sleeping off the previous night, followed by rigorous bathing, as much as possible, mind you, dressing, and preparing their appearance. Afternoons might involve light duties, conversation, or waiting for early clients. The afternoon delight crowd, if you will. Evenings were the busiest, with girls expected to be downstairs, ready to entertain, from dusk until the early hours of the morning. For the women, this was not a life of freedom or even genuine choice, but one of constant performance, intense emotional labour, and sheer physical exhaustion, all under the ever-present threat of disease, violence and utter destitution should their luck run out. It was a 24/7 hustle, with no benefits package. These brothels, from the opulent to the squalid, were more than just places for illicit transactions. They were deeply integrated social institutions, mirroring the class structures of the wider city. But beneath the velvet curtains and behind the discreetly managed doors, the true chilling secret was the systemic dehumanization of the women, trapped in a relentless machinery of vice, their lives dictated by the madam's rules, and the insatiable demands of a society that refused to acknowledge its own complicity. We've illuminated the architectural camouflage and the madam's iron rule within Victorian London's hidden brothels. Now, let's turn our gaze to the most crucial, yet most silenced, figures within these gilded or grimy cages. The women themselves, often euphemistically called unfortunates or fallen women. Understanding their pathways into this desperate trade, the illusory choices they faced, and the immense personal price they paid, is to truly grasp the chilling heart of Victorian vice. This wasn't a world of romanticised liberation. It was a brutal machinery fueled by systemic poverty, societal hypocrisy, and the tragic absence of viable alternatives. And let me tell you, it gets dark here. The backgrounds of these women were heartbreakingly diverse, yet overwhelmingly rooted in profound economic hardship. Many were young, often mere teenagers, who had arrived in London from rural areas, lured by the shiny promise of work in the booming capital. They sought positions as domestic servants, factory workers, or seamstresses, only to discover that wages were starvation level, hours were grueling, and conditions were exploitative. A typical domestic servant might earn a few shillings a week, barely enough for room and board, with no savings. Factory work paid even less, and skilled needlework, like making shirts, could earn as little as a few pence for a full day's labour, a pittance that couldn't even guarantee a single meal. When sickness, unemployment, or a sudden accident struck, leaving them without the means to pay rent, the streets or the workhouse loomed as terrifying alternatives. A fate many considered worse than death, and probably for good reason. For many, the initial fall was less a conscious choice and more a slow, inexorable slide into desperation. A young woman might be seduced and abandoned by an employer or a sweetheart, finding herself pregnant and alone, shunned by a society that valued her purity above all else. With no family support, no means of earning a respectable living, and the stigma of an illegitimate child, her options narrowed terrifyingly, faster than a gaslight flickering out. Others faced outright coercion, kidnapped, trafficked, or entrapped by ruthless procurers, known as ponces, or fancy men, who promised employment or marriage, only to force them into prostitution upon arrival in the city. The illusion of choice was often just that, an illusion, a cruel mirage in a desert of destitution, like being offered a cup of water, only to find it's filled with quicksand. Once initiated into the trade, the women found themselves caught in a vicious cycle. The madam, as we discussed, often saddled them with crippling debts for their initial clothing, lodging, and even advertising, ensuring they could never save enough to leave. This debt slavery was a powerful, invisible chain, far stronger than any visible manacles. Furthermore, the constant need to present a particular image, whether the elegant lady of a high-class brothel or the brazen streetwalker, required expenditure on clothes, cosmetics, and the cheap gin that often dulled the edges of their grim reality. These expenses were always deducted from their meagre earnings, perpetuating their financial bondage. It was a treadmill where the finish line kept moving further away. The demand for constant performance, The forced gaiety, the need to flatter and cajole, often demanding and abusive clients, constituted intense emotional labour. For women in high-class brothels, there was the added pressure of maintaining an air of sophistication, engaging in witty conversation, and displaying a superficial education, all while suppressing their true feelings and personal identity. For those in lower-end establishments, the encounters were often swift, brutal, and utterly dehumanizing. The dangers were manifold and ever-present. Disease was rampant. Syphilis and gonorrhea, in an age before antibiotics, were devastating and often fatal. Many women suffered from chronic infections, pain, and disfigurement. The life expectancy of a Victorian prostitute was tragically short, often cut short by venereal disease, complications from illegal abortions, violence, or alcoholism. The illusion of a gay life was quickly shattered by the grim reality of a body racked by illness. You were lucky to make it 5 years, let alone a decade. Violence was another constant threat. Clients could be abusive, and pimps or madams often inflicted brutal beatings for perceived transgressions. On the streets, attacks and robberies were commonplace. There was little recourse for these women, as the police often viewed them as criminals rather than victims, turning a blind eye to their suffering or even participating in their exploitation. The law, far from offering protection, often served to further entrench their vulnerability. Because when you're already at the bottom, there's always someone ready to kick you down further. The career of a Victorian prostitute was often tragically brief. Youth and beauty were her only real assets, and these faded quickly under the harsh conditions, disease, and constant stress. A woman might start in a high-class brothel, enjoying a brief period of relative luxury, only to find herself sliding down the social ladder of prostitution as she aged or lost her looks. From a fancy house, she might move to a mid-range establishment, then to a flash house, and eventually to the streets, where the dangers were greatest and the earnings lowest. The ultimate fate for many was the workhouse, a prison, a madhouse, often for hysteria or moral insanity, or an early grave, sometimes unmarked in a pauper's cemetery. A truly grim progression. And a few found refuge in Magdalene asylums, or reformatories, institutions often run by religious charities, which promised redemption but often imposed harsh, punitive regimes, demanding moral repentance and training them for domestic service. A return, ironically, to the very kind of work many had fled. It was less a rescue, more a repackaging of servitude. The chilling secret, then, was not just the existence of these brothels, but the systemic human cost. Their hidden lives within these gilded or grimy cages were a testament to Victorian London's profound hypocrisy, a stark reminder that beneath the veneer of progress and piety, countless women were sacrificed to sustain a shadow economy, their lives consumed by an industry that simultaneously profited from and utterly dehumanized them. The price of respectability for one part of society was paid in the suffering of another. We've explored the desperate lives of the women caught in the vice industry and the iron grip of the madams. Now, it's time to turn our gaze to the other side of the transaction, the discreet gentlemen, the clients whose demand fueled this vast subterranean economy. These were the men who, by day, might be pillars of Victorian society. Prominent businessmen, respected professionals, politicians, aristocrats, and even members of the clergy. By night, they slipped into the shadows, their desires driving them into the hidden brothels, creating an elaborate dance of hypocrisy that was central to London's chilling secrets. The ultimate double life. They represented a cross-section of male Victorian society, though generally with enough disposable income to afford the illicit pleasure. Young, unattached bachelors, often living away from home for the first time in the sprawling anonymity of London, formed a significant portion of the clientele. But so did married men, constrained by the rigid moral expectations of their wives and the pressures of late Victorian marriage, where women were idealized as pure, often asexual, angels in the house. For many, the brothel offered a space for physical release, a rebellion against the suffocating prudery of the age, and a place where their respectable desires could be indulged without fear of social ruin, provided they maintained absolute discretion. Think of it as their dirty little secret tucked away behind a polite cough. The motivations were complex. Beyond mere sexual gratification, brothels offered a retreat from the demanding facade of Victorian morality. In these hidden spaces, men could shed the constraints of their public personas, indulge in forbidden pleasures, and engage in conversations or activities that would be unthinkable in their drawing rooms. For some, it was an escape from loveless marriages. For others, a quest for novelty or perversion. For many, simply a release of urges society outwardly condemned but privately acknowledged as natural for men. The anonymity of London was their greatest ally, a city so vast that one could easily disappear into its fog and emerge untarnished, like a particularly forgetful ghost. Maintaining discretion and secrecy was an art form perfected by both client and establishment. High-class brothels in affluent areas operated with surgical precision to protect the reputations of their distinguished patrons. Carriages would draw up to back entrances or mews, away from the gaze of nosy neighbours. Clients often used coded language when booking appointments or giving instructions to cabmen. Silent, well-trained servants would ensure a seamless, unobserved entry and exit. The interiors of these houses were designed to exude comfort and exclusivity, making the client feel secure and pampered, far removed from the sordid reality. Privacy in these establishments was meticulously guarded, ensuring that a gentleman's indiscretion remained precisely that. Nobody wanted a scandal, after all, unless it was someone else's. For the middle-class patron, discretion was still important, but perhaps less elaborately managed. Public houses, oyster bars, or music halls often served as initial meeting points, or even as covert fronts for brothels. A trusted cabman, knowing the city's underbelly, could be an invaluable accomplice, ferrying gentlemen to and from their illicit destinations without asking questions. The fog and dim gaslight of London nights themselves provided a natural cloak for many a secret rendezvous. The city itself was a co-conspirator. The role of law enforcement and the broader legal framework in this ecosystem of vice was a study in profound hypocrisy and selective blindness. While laws technically existed to prosecute disorderly houses and prostitutes, the latter often the primary target, enforcement was notoriously inconsistent and often corrupt. Police raids, when they occurred, often targeted the lowest rungs of the trade, streetwalkers in the poorest districts or flash houses that lacked the funds to pay protection money. High-end brothels, serving influential clients, were often immune, their operations tacitly protected by a network of bribes and unspoken agreements with local constabularies. A madam with enough financial clout could ensure her establishment remained undisturbed, effectively buying immunity. Justice, it seemed, was a commodity. The most insidious legal intervention was the Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 1866 and 1869. These acts, initially applied to military and port towns, but reflecting a wider societal attitude, mandated compulsory examinations of women suspected of being prostitutes. If found to be infected with a venereal disease, they could be detained in lock hospitals for months, often against their will, and with brutal, unhygienic treatments. Crucially, these acts applied only to women. The male clients, who were the source and carriers of the infection, faced no such scrutiny or forced examination. This legislative hypocrisy further cemented the societal double standard, effectively punishing women for a problem created and perpetuated by male demand, while absolving the respectable men of any responsibility. The acts were a powerful tool for social control and dehumanization, adding another layer of chilling surveillance and brutality to the lives of vulnerable women. It was medical abuse, sanctioned by the state. Beyond simple sexual encounters, brothels also functioned as social spaces for men, albeit illicit ones. For young men especially, they could be places to drink, gamble, and socialize with like-minded individuals, escaping the rigid formality of their respectable clubs or drawing rooms. These establishments could even facilitate networking, with discreet conversations and business dealings taking place in private parlours. The sense of shared transgression created a strange camaraderie among patrons, a hidden fraternity of men who collectively participated in the city's secret life. A sort of gentleman's club, but with much less decorum. The chilling secret of Victorian London's brothels was therefore not just the hidden locations or the desperate lives of the women. It was the profound, systemic complicity of respectable society itself, particularly its male half. It was the vast, unspoken agreement to maintain a rigid facade of morality, while simultaneously feeding a ravenous appetite for illicit pleasure. The discreet gentleman, slipping into a hidden brothel, was not merely a customer, he was an active participant in a system of exploitation, protected by a veil of hypocrisy and a legal framework designed to punish the visible symptoms of vice, while protecting its powerful, often unseen causes. The darkness of Victorian London's brothels was illuminated, in part, by the very gaslights of society's selective morality. A truly bitter irony. We've explored the discreet gentlemen, their complicity, and the glaring hypocrisy of Victorian society. Now, let's confront the nuanced, yet equally brutal, reality of the sex trade's internal hierarchy. Victorian London's hidden brothels weren't a monolithic entity. They existed in a complex, often fluid, tiered system that mirrored the rigid class structure of the wider city. From the opulent, whispered-about duchesses of vice to the desperate daughters of despair, haunting the grimiest corners, each tier represented a different level of exploitation, a varying degree of danger, and a starkly different trajectory for the women trapped within its cruel machinery. It was less a ladder, more a slippery slope to hell. At the very pinnacle of this inverted hierarchy were the kept women or courtesans. These were not, strictly speaking, women working in a brothel, but their existence was fundamentally tied to the sex trade. A courtesan might be maintained by a single wealthy patron, living in a fashionable apartment, dressed in exquisite silks, and attended by servants. She might possess considerable charm, intelligence, and cultivate an air of sophisticated allure. Her services were exclusive, her company sought after, and her life, superficially, might appear luxurious. However, this was a gilded cage of a different sort. Her economic security was entirely dependent on the whim of her patron. Should he tire of her, or face financial ruin, she could be cast out with little recourse, often plunging rapidly down the tiers of the sex trade. Her reputation was forever tarnished, making a return to respectable society utterly impossible, regardless of her outward elegance. One bad breakup, and your life was over. Just below the courtesans were the women in the high-class fancy houses or board and lodging houses that we briefly touched upon. These were the true duchesses of vice, women chosen for their beauty, wit, and ability to entertain. They lived in sumptuously decorated brothels, dined on fine food, wore fashionable gowns often provided by the madam, for which they were deeply indebted, and served an exclusive clientele of aristocrats, politicians, and wealthy merchants. The illusion was one of genteel domesticity, even glamour. Clients would visit, enjoy champagne, witty conversation, and the company of beautiful, seemingly unburdened women. The prices were exorbitant, the discretion absolute. For the women, life here offered a temporary reprieve from abject poverty, the chance for better food, shelter, and occasionally, genuine affection from a client. Yet, the price was their youth, their emotional authenticity, and the constant fear of disease, or the madam's arbitrary cruelty. Their career in this tier was short. Even a slight fading of beauty or a visible sign of age could lead to a swift demotion. From duchess to, well, we'll get there. The next tier encompassed the mid-range brothels, often located around Theatreland, the Strand, or more bustling commercial districts. These catered to the burgeoning middle class, clerks, shopkeepers, professional men, and soldiers. The houses were less opulent, but still generally clean and well-maintained. The women, while perhaps less refined than their high-class counterparts, were still expected to be attractive, amiable, and discreet. The emphasis here was more on volume and accessibility. The parlour might be livelier, with a piano playing and more overt flirtation. Prices were lower than the fancy houses, meaning the women had to see more clients to earn their share. The dangers of disease and violence began to increase significantly at this level, as discretion was less absolute and clientele could be rougher. These brothels often served as a stepping stone for women who had once been in higher class houses, but were losing their youth, or for those new to the trade who quickly learned its harsh realities. The glow was dimming, and the cracks were showing. Further down the spiralling descent were the flash houses, or penny gaffs, found in the poorer, grittier districts like Whitechapel, Seven Dials, or the notorious rookeries. These were crude, overcrowded establishments, often occupying a single room or a few shared rooms in a tenement. The women here were truly the daughters of despair. Often aged prematurely by hardship and disease, they were typically less attractive, less well-dressed, and often struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction, like laudanum, a common opiate. Clients were drawn from the working class, labourers, sailors, casual workers, and prices were minimal, sometimes literally a penny a trick. The atmosphere was often squalid, noisy, and rife with violence. Disease was rampant, and the risk of abuse from clients, pimps, or madams was constant. Privacy was non-existent, and the encounters were brutal, swift, and utterly dehumanizing. For the women here, prostitution was a daily grind of sheer survival, with virtually no hope of escape. Their lives were short, brutal, and often ended in the workhouse, a prison cell, or an anonymous pauper's grave. A truly chilling endpoint. At the very bottom of the ladder were the streetwalkers, women who plied their trade directly on the streets, alleys, and bridges of London. They often had no brothel protection, no madam, though some were controlled by brutal pimps, and were the most vulnerable to the elements, disease, violence, and arrest. They had to be brazen and constantly vigilant. Their pitch might be a particular street corner, a dark alleyway, or outside a pub. Their clients were often the most desperate or the most opportunistic, and their earnings were meagre, barely enough to buy a few hours of shelter or a meal. These women were the most visible symbols of Victorian vice, yet also the most utterly exposed to its harshest realities, often being the first targets of police raids and the Contagious Diseases Acts. They were the front line and the first to fall. The flow between these tiers was generally one way, downwards. A woman might start in a higher class establishment, but as youth faded, disease set in, or alcoholism took hold, she would invariably slide down, losing status, earnings, and what little protection she once had. An upward movement was exceptionally rare, usually requiring a stroke of incredible luck, like being taken on as a kept woman, or managing to save enough to exit the trade entirely. Because once you're in, getting out is a near impossible feat. This tiered system underscores the chilling reality of Victorian London's hidden brothels. It was a vast, unforgiving machine, meticulously designed to exploit women at every level, offering varying degrees of temporary relief or illusory luxury, but ultimately leading to the same, often tragic, destination. The distinctions between the duchesses and the daughters were profound in their immediate circumstances, but beneath the surface, all shared the chilling secret of a life consumed by societal hypocrisy and relentless exploitation. We've illuminated the rigid hierarchy of brothels and the tragic paths of the women within them. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the unseen machinery that kept this vast industry grinding, the shadowy figures who profited most directly, the insidious forms of protection, offered and demanded, and the constant peril that defined the lives of those caught in its gears. Because the hidden brothels of Victorian London were not just places of illicit encounters, they were tightly controlled enterprises, secured by networks of complicity, coercion, and brutal force, where genuine safety was a myth. And protection was just another word for exploitation. It was a well-oiled, highly profitable, and utterly soul-crushing machine. At the heart of this unseen machinery were the procurers, pimps, and fancy men. These were the men who operated in the grim space between the supply of desperate women and the demand of eager clients. Their methods of recruitment were as varied as they were ruthless. Many preyed on young, naive girls newly arrived from the countryside, promising legitimate work as domestic servants or seamstresses, only to entrap them in debt and force them into prostitution upon their arrival in the sprawling, anonymous city. Others targeted vulnerable women already teetering on the brink of destitution, offering a solution to their immediate poverty that quickly turned into a trap. These men were often charming, persuasive, and utterly ruthless, skilled at identifying and manipulating their targets. Once a woman was under their sway, she would often be moved from city to city or brothel to brothel, her identity stripped away, her will broken by a combination of psychological abuse, debt, and physical violence. The promise of love or security from a fancy man was often just another chain binding a woman to her fate, and it was a chain forged in lies. The concept of protection in this world was a twisted parody of its true meaning. For the women, particularly streetwalkers or those in lower-tier brothels, a pimp often presented himself as their protector against the dangers of the street. Abusive clients, rival prostitutes, or even rogue police officers. In reality, this protection almost always came at a steep price, a significant portion of their earnings, absolute obedience, and the constant threat of brutal physical violence should they fail to comply. Pimping was a lucrative enterprise, built on controlling women's bodies and labour, and these men were often deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, using intimidation and force to maintain their grip. The very men who claimed to protect them were often their greatest abusers, creating a terrifying paradox where the illusion of safety came with profound personal risk. It was protection, all right, but only for the pimp's profits. Madams, too, operated under a system of protection, but theirs was often more institutionalized. A high-class madam running a lucrative establishment needed to ensure the smooth, uninterrupted flow of her business. This meant cultivating a network of tacit complicity, particularly with corrupt elements of the police force. Bribes, regular payoffs, or gifts were often necessary to ensure that her house was not raided, that her girls were not arbitrarily arrested, and that any incidents involving wealthy clients were quietly swept under the rug. This informal system of bribery and collusion meant that the law, designed to uphold order, was often actively subverted, allowing the vice industry to flourish largely unchecked in its most profitable segments. Police constables, earning meagre wages, could be easily tempted by the extra shillings offered for turning a blind eye, making them both enforcers of the law and tacit protectors of illegality. It was a system that smelled faintly of gaslight and dirty money. Beyond the police, other figures played a role in this network of unseen machinery. Cabmen and coachmen often served as discreet conduits, ferrying clients to known brothels or acting as intermediaries, sometimes earning a commission for their referrals. Laundry services, food suppliers, and even jewelers or dressmakers, who often provided clothing to brothels on credit, which then became part of a woman's debt, were all, to varying degrees, woven into this intricate economic web, often aware of the true nature of their clients, yet choosing to ignore it for financial gain. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of the pie, no matter how unsavoury the ingredients. The peril faced by the women in these brothels was multi-layered and constant. Beyond the ever-present threat of disease, syphilis, gonorrhea and tuberculosis, which thrived in overcrowded, damp conditions, there was the daily risk of physical violence from clients, pimps, or even fellow prostitutes. Sexual assault was a constant threat, and there was virtually no legal recourse for a fallen woman who was raped. Her testimony would be dismissed, her character automatically impugned. Injuries, often severe, could go untreated, leading to chronic pain or disfigurement. Their bodies were not their own, and neither was their safety. The fear of arrest and imprisonment was also a constant companion, especially for streetwalkers. While arrests were often selective, a stint in prison or worse being committed to a lock hospital under the Contagious Diseases Acts, as discussed earlier, was a horrifying prospect. These hospitals, though ostensibly for treatment, were often punitive, designed to cleanse women both physically and morally. The examinations were brutal and dehumanizing, the treatments painful and ineffective, and the women were often subjected to lectures on their fallen status. They were effectively imprisoned until deemed cured, only to be released back into the same desperate circumstances that drove them into prostitution in the first place, ensuring a quick return to both the trade and reinfection. It was a revolving door of misery. Furthermore, the women lived with the perpetual threat of economic destitution. Should they fall ill, lose their looks, incur the madam's wrath, or simply age out of the trade, they faced being thrown out onto the streets with nothing. The workhouse, with its brutal conditions and crushing monotony, was a terrifying final destination for many. The psychological pressure of this precarious existence, the constant need to please, to perform, to earn, all while knowing their future was hanging by a thread, was immense, often leading to alcoholism, drug addiction, like laudanum or opiates, and profound mental anguish. They became another chain binding them to their gilded cages, but this one was internal. The protection offered in this chilling world was therefore a cruel irony. It protected the profits of madams and pimps, safeguarded the reputations of wealthy clients, and maintained the outward appearance of order for corrupt officials. But for the women caught within its grip, it offered little true security, only another layer of control and exploitation, further entrenching them in a life of profound peril. The chilling secret was that this elaborate machinery of vice, for all its hidden operations, was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a highly organized, deeply corrupt, and brutally effective system of human exploitation, woven into the very fabric of Victorian London's hidden power structures. Now, let's confront perhaps the most chilling secret, the one etched not on a hidden door, but upon the very bodies and souls of the women themselves. The relentless onslaught of disease, the crushing weight of despair, and the horrifying reality of a life where the body became a constant battleground, a fragile vessel constantly under siege. Because in Victorian London's hidden brothels, the true cost of vice was paid in agony, disfigurement, and ultimately, a tragically shortened life. It was a biological nightmare playing out in slow motion. The spectre of venereal disease loomed large and terrifyingly real over every woman in the sex trade. In an era before antibiotics or effective medical treatments, syphilis and gonorrhea were devastating, often incurable, and widely prevalent. Syphilis in particular was a horrifying progression. It began with sores, often painless, which might be dismissed. But left untreated, it advanced to secondary stages, manifesting in rashes, fever, hair loss, and chronic pain. The tertiary stage, years later, could lead to neurological damage, blindness, deafness, paralysis, disfigurement, like the collapse of the nasal bridge, and ultimately madness and a slow, agonizing death. Imagine living with this ticking time bomb in your body, witnessing its horrors in fellow inmates, knowing there was no escape, no cure, only a gradual, inevitable decline into a nightmare. It was a slow-motion horror film, with you as the star. The treatments available were often as brutal as the diseases themselves. Mercury, used for syphilis, caused its own poisoning symptoms, including neurological damage, loss of teeth, and chronic pain. Pessaries, vaginal inserts, and douches were often crude and ineffective, causing further irritation and infection rather than relief. The lack of hygiene in many establishments, the constant physical contact, and the repeated exposure to infected clients ensured that these diseases spread with terrifying efficiency, turning the brothel into a veritable incubator of suffering. Beyond venereal diseases, women in brothels were susceptible to a host of other ailments. Tuberculosis, rampant in overcrowded, damp and poorly ventilated Victorian slums, was a common killer, exacerbated by the constant strain on their bodies and often inadequate nutrition. Chronic respiratory infections, fevers, skin ailments from poor hygiene and scratching at parasites, and issues related to repeated pregnancies and often self-induced or illegal abortions further ravaged their health. The life expectancy of a Victorian prostitute was tragically short, often little more than 5 to 10 years after entering the trade, far below the average, her body ravaged by illness, addiction, and constant stress. A ticking clock that ran out far too soon. The infamous lock hospitals, institutions mandated by the Contagious Diseases Acts, as discussed earlier, were a chilling manifestation of society's response to this health crisis, again, exclusively targeting women. Women suspected of being prostitutes, even if not engaged in street walking, could be subjected to forced, invasive medical examinations by police surgeons. If found to be infected, they were incarcerated in these hospitals for months, often against their will. While ostensibly for treatment, these institutions were often punitive, designed to cleanse women both physically and morally. The examinations were brutal and dehumanizing, the treatments painful and ineffective, and the women were often subjected to lectures on their fallen status. They were effectively imprisoned until deemed cured, only to be released back into the same desperate circumstances that drove them into prostitution in the first place, ensuring a quick return to both the trade and reinfection. It was a system designed to punish, not heal. The emotional and psychological toll was perhaps even more profound than the physical suffering. Living a life of constant performance, forced gaiety, and emotional suppression. Charming clients, enduring abuse, masking disgust, created a profound sense of dehumanization and a loss of self. Many women adopted false names, fabricated pasts, and learned to disconnect from their true identities as a coping mechanism. The constant emotional labor, the selling of intimacy without genuine connection, and the relentless commodification of their bodies led to deep-seated trauma, anxiety, and depression. It was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit. To cope with this unbearable reality, alcohol and drug addiction became rampant. Cheap gin, readily available and potent, offered a temporary escape from the cold, hunger, pain, and emotional anguish. Laudanum, an opiate widely available and unregulated, provided a more profound numbing, allowing women to endure the unendurable. These addictions, while offering fleeting relief, only further trapped them, eroding their health, making them even more vulnerable to exploitation, and deepening their financial dependence on madams or pimps. They became another chain binding them to their gilded cages, a chemical and psychological one. The cycle of despair and hopelessness was relentless. For many, the initial illusion of quick money and a temporary escape from poverty quickly faded, replaced by the crushing realization that there was no way out. The constant threat of disease, violence, destitution, and social condemnation created an existential dread that permeated every aspect of their lives. Hope, a precious commodity, was often extinguished, leaving behind a profound sense of fatalism. This despair was often worsened by the isolation inherent in their situation, shunned by respectable society, often estranged from their families, and finding only superficial companionship within the brothel. A truly lonely existence. Even the architecture of the brothel contributed to this psychological state. The discreet curtained windows and hidden entrances, while protecting clients, also served to literally imprison the women, cutting them off from the outside world, creating a sense of being perpetually hidden, confined, and ultimately forgotten by respectable society. The gilded cages were, in essence, mental prisons as well. The chilling secret of Victorian London's hidden brothels, therefore, extended far beyond the walls and the transactions. It was the pervasive, systematic destruction of human potential, the extinguishing of hope, and the profound suffering inflicted on countless women whose bodies became battlegrounds against disease and despair. Their short, brutal lives stand as a haunting testament to a society's profound hypocrisy. A society that demanded moral purity while simultaneously creating and profiting from an industry that utterly consumed its fallen daughters. A truly devastating cost. we've illuminated the shadow economy and the pervasive corruption that allowed Victorian London's hidden vice to flourish. From fervent religious zealots to passionate social activists, these rescuers embarked on missions to reclaim fallen women. But their efforts often revealed another layer of chilling secrets: the harsh, often punitive path to redemption, and a profound misunderstanding of the systemic issues that drove women into the sex trade in the first place, because sometimes even good intentions pave a very rough road. Imagine the shock and horror of the Victorian middle and upper classes as the sheer scale of prostitution became undeniable. While many preferred to ignore it, a growing number of individuals and organisations felt a moral imperative to intervene. These were largely driven by evangelical Christian fervour, viewing prostitution primarily as a moral failing, a sin against God and society. Their motivations were a complex blend of genuine charity, sincere religious conviction, social control, the fear of moral decay corrupting the nation, and sometimes a thinly veiled condemnation of the women themselves. "We're saving you from yourselves," they seem to say, "but only if you conform." This moral panic led to the establishment of numerous rescue societies, Magdalene asylums, and reformatories. These institutions, often run by charitable organisations, religious orders, or concerned philanthropists, aim to remove women from the streets and brothels and guide them towards a respectable life. Their mission was clear: to offer a path to redemption, to cleanse both the body and the soul of the taint of vice. A spiritual detox, if you will. The reality inside these institutions, however, was often far from the benevolent image they projected. Upon entering, women were typically stripped of their old clothes, symbols of their fallen life, forced to adopt a uniform, and often made to perform arduous labour like laundry, sewing, or domestic chores. Ironically, often the very type of low wage work that had failed to sustain them in the first place. Their days were strictly regimented, filled with moral instruction, prayer, and labour. Silence was often enforced, and any perceived act of defiance or unrepentant behaviour could lead to solitary confinement, meagre rations, or even physical punishment. It was less a sanctuary, more a moral boot camp. The path to redemption was contingent upon a profound display of moral repentance. Women were expected to confess their sins, express deep remorse, and commit to a life of virtue. Those who showed insufficient contrition were often deemed incorrigible and expelled, thrown back onto the streets, often with an even deeper stigma. The psychological toll of these institutions could be immense, as women were stripped of their autonomy, individuality, and forced into a performance of piety that may or may not have reflected their true feelings. Many, desperate for a roof over their heads, learned to feign repentance, mastering the language of contrition to survive. Because when you're desperate, you learn to play the part. One of the greatest flaws of these reform movements was their fundamental misunderstanding of the root causes of prostitution. While they preached moral purity, they largely failed to address the systemic issues of poverty, lack of education, abysmal wages for women, and male demand that drove women into the sex trade. They focused on rescuing the individual, rather than reforming the societal conditions that created the fallen. Consequently, many women, even after enduring the harsh regimes of these asylums, found themselves with few viable options upon release. With their reputations irrevocably tainted and limited skills, they often slid back into prostitution, perpetuating the very cycle the reformers sought to break. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound. However, not all reform efforts were blind to these systemic issues. Figures like Josephine Butler emerged as powerful, radical voices challenging the prevailing hypocrisy. Butler, a Victorian feminist and social reformer, vehemently opposed the Contagious Diseases Acts, which we discussed earlier. Her activism, alongside her Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, brought the issue of state, regulated prostitution and the plight of fallen women into unprecedented public discourse, stirring widespread outrage and ultimately leading to the repeal of the Acts in 1886. Butler's work marked a crucial shift, moving the conversation from purely moral condemnation to one of social justice, civil rights, and a direct challenge to male sexual privilege. She saw the forest, not just the individual trees. Other reformers focused on preventative measures, establishing homes for working girls, offering vocational training, or campaigning for better wages and working conditions for women, recognizing that economic desperation was a primary driver. Yet, these efforts, while vital, were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem and the deep-seated economic structures that benefited from cheap, exploitable female labor. It was a fight against a current that was far too strong. The chilling secret revealed by these reform efforts, then, was multifaceted. It was the stark reality that redemption came at a steep price of personal freedom and autonomy, often failing to offer true, sustainable alternatives. It was the profound disconnect between the reformers' moral fervour and the socio-economic realities faced by the women they sought to save. And it was the uncomfortable truth that society, while quick to condemn the fallen woman, was far slower to dismantle the systems of poverty and hypocrisy that created her, or to hold the respectable gentleman accountable for his role. The Magdalen asylums stood as grim, well-intentioned monuments to this societal failure, offering a harsh conditional salvation in a city that often preferred to ignore the deeper wounds festering beneath its pious surface. A well-meaning, but tragically limited attempt. We've peeled back layer after layer of Victorian London's hidden brothels, from their opulent facades to the brutal realities within, from the complicity of clients to the often punitive path to redemption. Now, as the Victorian era drew to a close and the new century dawned, the intricate, shadowy world of commercial vice began to undergo significant, albeit slow and uneven, transformations. This explores the impact of increased public scrutiny, the gradual shift in social attitudes, and how the chilling secrets began to be reluctantly dragged into the dim light of public awareness, even as new forms of exploitation emerged to replace the old. Because progress, much like London fog, is often slow to burn off. As the late 19th century progressed, the impenetrable veil of secrecy over London's vice districts began to fray, largely due to the tireless efforts of social reformers, journalists, and a burgeoning investigative press. Figures like W.T. Stead, whose explosive 1885 exposé, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, sensationally revealed the horrors of child prostitution and sex trafficking, sent shockwaves through respectable society. Stead's investigative journalism, though controversial and leading to his own imprisonment on a technicality, forced an uncomfortable public reckoning with the darkest aspects of the sex trade. No longer could the upper classes pretend these horrors were confined to the distant East End or the lowest strata of society. The evidence pointed to their ubiquity and the complicity of even the most powerful men. The whispers became shouts. This increased scrutiny, coupled with the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, largely due to Josephine Butler's relentless campaigning, began to shift the legal and social landscape, however subtly. While prostitution itself remained illegal and heavily stigmatized, the focus gradually began to move, in some quarters, from solely punishing the fallen woman, to acknowledging, if not fully addressing, the male demand and the systemic exploitation. Public pressure and philanthropic efforts led to a greater, though still inadequate, establishment of rescue homes and support services that were, at least in theory, less punitive and more genuinely rehabilitative. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The economics of the vice trade also began to change. As London grew and transportation improved, the old model of large, centralised brothels began to face competition from more discreet, individualised forms of prostitution. The rise of the call girl, or parlour maid, who might work from a rented room or visit clients by appointment, allowed for greater anonymity and potentially more agency for the women, albeit still with immense risks. This decentralisation made the industry harder to police, and also harder for large brothels to control the market. The madam, as the all-powerful figure, began to be challenged by other forms of organisation. Simultaneously, the changing urban landscape contributed to the slow fading of the traditional brothel. Slum clearances, driven by public health concerns and urban development projects, gradually dismantled some of the notorious rookeries and hidden alleys where many lower-tier brothels had thrived. While this often simply displaced the problem rather than solving it, it made the older, more overt forms of vice less physically entrenched in certain areas. The expansion of London's suburbs also allowed more men to live away from the city's immediate centre, potentially reducing the sheer concentration of casual clientele in the old vice districts. Out of sight, out of mind for some. The social fabric itself was evolving. The New Woman movement challenged Victorian ideals of female purity and domesticity, advocating for greater independence, education, and economic opportunities for women. While these changes were slow and met with fierce resistance, they began to offer more viable alternatives for young women beyond domestic service or the desperate turn to prostitution. Improved working conditions and wages, though still abysmal, slowly provided a slightly wider margin of survival for some. The rigid moral codes, while still powerful, faced growing intellectual challenges, particularly from early sociologists and psychologists who began to view prostitution as a social problem rather than purely a moral failing. The conversation was finally, painstakingly, starting to evolve. However, it's crucial to understand that these changes were gradual and did not eradicate the problem. The hidden brothels didn't simply vanish with the fading gaslight. Instead, they adapted, becoming more discreet, more decentralized, and in some ways even harder to detect. The chilling secrets merely shifted their form, moving from the overtly opulent or squalid houses to quieter, more clandestine arrangements. Trafficking and exploitation continued, preying on women from even further afield as international networks of vice began to emerge. The demand from discreet gentlemen remained, simply finding new channels and methods to indulge. The monster just changed its skin. The legacy of Victorian London's hidden brothels is one of profound social commentary. They stand as a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the vast gulf between public morality and private desire, between societal aspiration and grim reality. They represent a period when a thriving empire, obsessed with respectability, simultaneously fostered and then relentlessly exploited a vast underclass of women, their suffering meticulously documented in the archives of poverty, disease, and social injustice. The secrets of these brothels were not just about illicit sex, they were about class, gender, power, and the terrifying cost of hypocrisy. But the echoes of those chilling secrets, the despair of the unfortunates, the calculated ruthlessness of the madams, the complicity of the gentlemen, and the struggle of the reformers. A powerful testament to the enduring human stories buried beneath the veneer of progress. We have confronted the stark architectural deceptions, dissected the ruthless economic machinery of the madams and pimps, empathized with the tragic, often illusory choices faced by the unfortunates, observed the pervasive complicity of discreet gentlemen, and grappled with the often punitive efforts of well-meaning but flawed reformers. Now, as our comprehensive exploration concludes, let us step back from the specific details and contemplate the profound, enduring shadows cast by this hidden past. The lasting legacy, the uncomfortable lessons, and the crucial reflections it offers for understanding not just Victorian society, but the persistent complexities of human nature and social justice even today. It's a heavy history, but one we need to face. The legacy of Victorian London's hidden brothels is far more than a mere historical footnote. It is a powerful, unsettling social commentary etched into the very fabric of the city's history. These establishments, from the most opulent fancy houses to the most squalid cribs, stand as stark, uncomfortable monuments to the vast, often hypocritical, gulf between public morality and private desire, between lofty societal aspirations and grim, ground-level realities. They represent a period when a thriving empire, outwardly obsessed with respectability, piety, and the sanctity of the family, simultaneously fostered, tolerated, and then relentlessly exploited a vast, vulnerable underclass of women. Their suffering, their silent stories, and their tragically short lives are meticulously documented not just in the dusty archives of social reformers, but in the very prevalence of poverty, disease, and profound social injustice that defined the era, the price of an empire, often paid in human agony. One of the most crucial lessons from this era is the profound danger of societal hypocrisy and the sexual double standard. Victorian society vehemently condemned prostitution as the ultimate female sin, yet male demand for commercial sex was rampant and often went unpunished. Laws, like the Contagious Diseases Acts, explicitly targeted women for surveillance and brutal medical intervention, while men who frequented brothels faced no equivalent scrutiny. This created a system where women bore the full burden of societal condemnation and physical risk, while the male clientele, often pillars of the community, operated with relative impunity behind a veil of discretion. This historical reality serves as a powerful reminder of how moral codes can be selectively applied to maintain power imbalances and protect one segment of society at the expense of another's fundamental human rights and dignity. It's a double standard that still echoes today. Furthermore, the story of Victorian brothels highlights the intimate and devastating link between poverty and exploitation. For the vast majority of women who entered the sex trade, it was not a free choice, but a desperate measure for survival in a society that offered them appallingly few viable alternatives. Abysmal wages for respectable female labour, lack of education, limited property rights, and a lack of social safety nets meant that for many, the choice was often between prostitution and starvation, the workhouse, or absolute destitution. The chilling secret was that respectable society, through its economic structures and gender inequalities, actively created the conditions that pushed countless women into this brutal trade, then condemned them for it. This profound connection between economic vulnerability and exploitation remains a relevant and uncomfortable truth in many parts of the world today. Because when you have nothing, any option looks like a way out. The courage and limitations of social reform movements also offer critical insights. While figures like Josephine Butler bravely challenged the systemic injustices and sparked genuine change, the broader reform efforts often grappled with internal contradictions. Many well-intentioned rescue societies, while offering a semblance of refuge, ultimately failed to address the root causes of prostitution, focusing instead on individual moral repentance rather than widespread societal reform. Their redemption often came at the cost of a woman's autonomy and dignity, and many rescued women found themselves in a new form of servitude, or simply pushed back into the very cycle they had attempted to escape. This highlights the complex, often challenging, nature of social change and the importance of understanding systemic issues beyond individual blame. It's a reminder that even heroes can miss the bigger picture. The hidden brothels also revealed the pervasive nature of a shadow economy that integrated legitimate businesses and corrupt institutions. The network of suppliers, medical practitioners, transport providers, and even elements of law enforcement who wittingly or unwittingly profited from the sex trade demonstrated how deeply intertwined the illicit and the respectable could become. This economic ecosystem, generating vast sums of untaxed wealth, thrived on discretion and collective silence, illustrating how commerce often finds a way to profit from every human desire and despair, regardless of moral implications. Money, it seems, truly knows no morals. As London moved into the 20th century, the landscape of vice continued to evolve. The grand, gaslit brothels of the Victorian era gradually gave way to more discreet arrangements, individual call girls, and later, new forms of organised crime and international trafficking. The red lanterns might have faded, replaced by the flickering glow of electric signs, but the fundamental issues of exploitation, gender inequality, and the monetization of human vulnerability persisted. The chilling secrets simply shifted their form, adapting to new technologies and social norms, continuing to cast long shadows over modern society. The darkness just got better at hiding. Ultimately, understanding the chilling secrets of Victorian London's hidden brothels is to undertake a profound journey into the complexities of human nature, societal structures, and the often painful march of progress. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about class, gender, power, and the terrifying cost of hypocrisy. It reminds us that behind every veiled window and discreet door, there were countless human stories of desperation, suffering, resilience, and the relentless, often unacknowledged struggle for dignity. The echoes of these hidden pasts continue to resonate, urging us to reflect on how our own societies confront similar challenges today, and how much further we still have to go to truly shed the enduring shadows of exploitation and injustice. And that, in the detailed, immersive, and ultimately cautionary tapestry of history, is absolutely everything.